one claps when a man collapses in silence. There's no crowd when everything falls apart, just the echo of your own thoughts, and the weight you're left to carry alone. You try to hold the pieces, try to explain, try to be strong enough for others, until one day you stop trying. You disappear, but not because you've given up, because something deeper has begun. The most dangerous transformation doesn't start with rage. It starts with stillness. When you stop performing, when you stop chasing approval, when you sit with your pain and study it, that's where it begins. The quiet rebuild. The slow construction of something most people will never understand, a mind that no longer needs to be validated to know its worth. Not louder, not faster, but heavier. So grounded it makes others uncomfortable. So calm, they call it cold. So unreadable, it scares them. You're not here to impress. You're here to evolve. But stay with me, because by the end of this video, something inside you will shift. Quietly, permanently. This isn't a video about feeling better. It's about becoming someone people can't figure out. Someone they can't shake. Because when you build a mind so strong it doesn't flinch, the world notices. And the weak, they whisper. So if you've ever felt like you were breaking behind closed doors, but something inside you refused to quit, this is where your story begins. And if that part hit you, leave just 3 words in the comments. I kept going. You never know who might be scrolling looking for a reason to keep going too. The collapse that didn't kill you. There was a night you won't forget. Not because something dramatic happened, but because something inside you quietly died. No one heard it. No one noticed. But you felt it. That slow cracking beneath the surface, like the foundation you'd built your identity on was rotting from underneath. And now, it had given way. You were alone. Maybe not physically, but mentally completely. Surrounded by noise, but disconnected from meaning. You sat in a room that felt colder than it should have. Staring at nothing. Or maybe at the version of yourself you could no longer pretend to be. This wasn't a bad day. This wasn't stress or burnout. This was collapse. The unraveling of the story you told yourself. The end of, I've got this. And when it hit, no one came running. No applause. No rescue. Just silence. And that's when something changed. You didn't scream. You didn't post about it. You didn't tell your friends. You sat in the wreckage of your plans. And for the first time in a long time, you listened. Not to the world, but to the ache that had been growing for years. You realized you were chasing things you didn't respect. Pleasing people you didn't admire. Building a life that looked strong, but wasn't rooted in anything real. That illusion had to collapse. It needed to collapse. And so it did. That night, everything fell, but you didn't. You bent. You shattered. But something deeper held. It wasn't strength, not yet, but it was the seed of it. The awareness that pain, as brutal as it is, doesn't have to end you. That maybe suffering isn't proof of failure, but an invitation to rebuild something more honest. Maybe you weren't broken. Maybe you were being tested. Seneca once wrote, "Fire tests gold. Suffering tests brave men." You weren't gold yet, but you were in the fire now. And the burn was real. So was the fear, the shame, the numbness. But here's what no one talks about. There's a sacred kind of clarity that only comes in collapse. When there's nothing left to prove, when the mask slips, and all that's left is you. You didn't know it yet. But this was your beginning. Not the kind you celebrate, the kind you survive. You were raw, stripped, unimpressive, and that made you dangerous not to others, but to the version of you that used to hide behind noise, behind busyness, behind ego. That man was gone. And the one who remained had nothing to lose and everything to build. You didn't rise that night. You didn't fight. You didn't need to. You just stayed. You didn't quit on yourself. And that was enough. That's what most people miss. The first step toward becoming unshakable isn't dominance. It's endurance. The quiet decision to remain standing when everything familiar has collapsed. And you did. You stayed. That's where it started. You vanished to rebuild, not to run. You didn't make a grand exit. No speech. No angry goodbyes. One day, you just stopped showing up, stopped replying, stopped pretending. And to the outside world, it looked like you gave up. But they didn't understand. You weren't quitting. You were retreating. There's a difference. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is vanish. Not to escape, but to strip the noise away. To reclaim space. To bleed quietly without needing anyone to watch. The world says you're weak when you walk away. But they don't see what happens behind closed doors. The war inside, the dismantling of everything you thought made you strong. You weren't running. You were withdrawing to rebuild on your terms. For a while, everything went still. No calls, no updates. You ghosted people who once thought they knew you, not out of malice, but because explaining pain to those who never listened felt like screaming into a storm. So you chose silence. And silence became a sanctuary, a portal, necessary kind of peace. You stopped posting, stopped performing, and for the first time, stopped needing to be seen. At first, it felt like death, the death of relevance, of validation. You checked your phone out of habit, but no one was really reaching out. And that hurt in ways words can't express. But in that hollow space, something else began to grow, something quieter, stronger, more dangerous. It wasn't confidence, not yet. It was detachment from opinions, from approval, from the urge to explain yourself to people who'd already decided who you were. You learned to sit with your own discomfort. You stopped being afraid of being misunderstood. You stopped begging to be seen. And in that silence, you began to observe yourself, your past, the patterns, the masks, the compromises. You realized how much of your life had been spent acting instead of living. You weren't who you thought you were. And that truth didn't destroy you, it humbled you. That's when the shame lost its grip. Because once you see how far off course you were, there's freedom in stepping away from it all. Not as an escape, but as a return. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Withdraw into yourself. It's in your power to be reborn each day." That's exactly what you were doing. Not disappearing forever, but going dark, so you could relight something from within. Not to prove anything, but to remember everything. People forgot about you. Some mocked the silence. Some filled in the blanks with their own narratives. Let them. Because while they were guessing, you were growing. Quietly. Relentlessly. Alone. And here's the part they'll never understand. The man who disappears to fix himself comes back unrecognizable. Stronger. Not because of what he gained, but because of what he let go. Approval. image, noise, the need to be anything other than solid in his own presence. You disappeared, not to hide, but to unlearn. And now, with nothing left to lose, you're almost ready to return. If this part hit home, drop a comment. I disappeared to rebuild. You never know who's reading and healing too. Training in silence changed everything. It didn't feel like a breakthrough. It wasn't dramatic. No motivational playlist. No fire in your chest. Just a moment. Quiet. Unimpressive. You rolled out of bed not because you felt inspired, but because something in you whispered, enough. That morning, you didn't pick up your phone. You didn't scroll for permission to start. You just stood there barefoot, still half asleep, staring at yourself in the mirror. No affirmations. No flexing. Just truth. The version of you staring back wasn't a warrior. Not yet. But he was. Willing. You stepped into the shower and turned it cold. Not freezing. Not heroic. Just cold enough to make you flinch. And when it hit your skin, every cell screamed. But you didn't back away. You let it hit, because something had to change, and comfort wasn't going to deliver it. That was the beginning. You didn't call it training at the time. You didn't have a plan. Or a journal, or some catchy challenge to post about. You were just moving again, reaching for something real. You stretched your body, not for aesthetics, but to feel alive in your skin again. You did a push-up, and it felt heavy, embarrassingly heavy, but you didn't quit, because this wasn't about performance. This was about penance and promise. You made your bed, not because someone on YouTube told you to, but because the chaos in your room mirrored the chaos in your head, and for once, you wanted to win a battle, even a small one. And the best part? No one knew. You didn't post it, didn't text it to anyone, didn't ask for applause. This was sacred. This was yours. The world glorifies transformation, but only when it looks sexy. When it's shredded abs and time-lapse reels and big declarations. But the kind of rebuilding you were doing, it didn't look good. It looked like trembling hands on the edge of the bed, like saying no to the snooze button, like lifting 5-pound dumbbells when your ego remembered lifting 50. That's what made it powerful. Because now, you weren't performing. You were confronting. Every rep, a reckoning. Every uncomfortable choice, a vote for your future self. You didn't need a gym. You needed discipline, and discipline, you learned, could be practiced anywhere, in cold water, in stillness, in that moment when your body said no and your soul whispered, just one more. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself." You weren't there yet, but you were beginning to understand what that meant. It wasn't about self-hatred. It was about self-honor, holding yourself to a higher standard. Even when no one was watching, especially then, you started walking more, eating slower, saying less. You stopped debating people, stopped defending your silence. You no longer felt the urge to prove anything, not even your comeback, because you knew now the most dangerous man in any room is the one who has already suffered quietly, rebuilt silently, and no longer needs validation to keep going. And as the days passed, the habits stacked, not because they were glamorous, but because they were grounding. You were no longer building a body. You were building discipline as identity. You didn't chase intensity. You practiced consistency. You didn't shout your standards, you lived them. No one clapped. No one noticed. And that became your advantage. Because while they waited for signs, for proof you were coming back, you were already deep in the trenches earning your own respect, brick by quiet brick, with no audience, no mentor, no noise, just you, and the new code you were writing with your actions. Brick by brick, you built mental armor. You didn't become unbreakable overnight. No one does. It wasn't some movie montage. There was no dramatic soundtrack playing in the background. Just repetition. Quiet, unglamorous repetition. The kind most men won't stick around for. The kind that never makes headlines but always makes warriors. Every day, you laid a brick, not a real one, a mental one, with every difficult thing you chose not to avoid, every excuse you ignored, every moment you showed up when no one would have blamed you for staying down, you built. And what you were building wasn't for the world to admire. It wasn't for status. It wasn't even for revenge. You were building armor. Not the kind that hides your pain, but the kind that's forged from it. You used the cold when others looked for comfort. You used the silence when others filled it with noise. You used the rejection, the isolation, the emptiness. You turned them into weight. You trained under them. You learned how to carry things that once crushed you. That's the thing about mental strength. It's not loud. It's not flashy. It doesn't arrive with celebration. It arrives in stillness. When the cravings hit and you say, no. When fear whispers stop and you keep moving. When your ego wants to explain and you choose restraint. These aren't just habits. These are weapons. Quiet ones. The world sees power in volume. But real power, it's controlled. It's held back. It's silent until necessary. And you were learning that, step by step. There were days you didn't feel like it. Days your body ached. Days your mind screamed for escape. But you kept showing up. You kept doing the thing. Why? Because it wasn't about motivation anymore. It was about identity. You were no longer the man who tries. You were becoming the man who does without needing an audience. There's a kind of fear that follows men like you, not because you threaten, but because you don't waver, because you don't need to talk, because you're not emotionally available for manipulation. You've trained yourself to feel without flinching, to absorb without reacting. That scares people. Especially the ones who rely on chaos to control others. Epictetus once said, endure and renounce. 2 words, but they described the entire season you lived through. You endured the ache of rebuilding without recognition. You renounced the impulse to explain, to defend, to chase. And in doing so, you became untouchable. Your routine became sacred. It wasn't about six-packs or streaks or medals. It was about doing hard things consistently enough that they no longer felt hard. Waking up early wasn't punishment. It was reclaiming time. Cold showers weren't torture. They were declaration. I command myself. You didn't seek approval. You sought ownership over your mind, over your reactions, over your path. Brick by brick, you layered discipline over pain, vision over distraction, purpose over chaos, and slowly, that armor took shape not as a wall to hide behind, but as a framework you could carry into the fire without burning. And while others debated ideas, You acted. While they complained about outcomes, you adjusted inputs. While they demanded peace from the world, you created it inside yourself. Your calm became louder than their volume. Your consistency more intimidating than their aggression, because you didn't just look in control, you were. People didn't know how to approach you anymore. The same ones who once saw your silence as weakness now paused before speaking. Not because you threatened them, but because they could feel it, your center, the density of a man who suffered, restructured, and chose not to broadcast it. That's what real mental armor is. Not the absence of emotion, but the ability to carry it without breaking. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it steer. Not dominance over others, but command over self. And you earned it. Alone, in the dark, with no one watching, no one clapping, no one saving you. That's what makes it real, and that's why it lasts. If you're rebuilding in silence too, type one brick at a time. This is your moment. You turned silence into a weapon. There was a moment when it would have been easy to react. Someone had disrespected you. Again, not with fists, but with words sarcastic, subtle, meant to sting just enough to draw blood, but not enough to look obvious. The old you would have taken the bait. You would have defended, explained, maybe even raised your voice. But this time, you didn't. You looked at them calm, steady, unreadable, and then you said nothing. Not because you were scared, not because you didn't have a response, but because you didn't need one. That silence, it shook them, because they expected noise, emotion, a reaction they could feed on, escalate, manipulate. But you gave them emptiness, and, in that space, they saw themselves more clearly than they wanted to. That was the day they realized you weren't the same man anymore. You weren't hiding. You weren't avoiding. You were controlling the frame. Your silence wasn't weakness. It was structure. It was command. It was the sound of a man who has nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. People talk about power like it lives in volume, aggression, comebacks. But you learned the hard way. Real power lives in restraint, in the ability to take an insult, a dismissal, a baited moment, and choose stillness, not as passivity, but as precision. You weren't passive. You were calculating, measuring, choosing whether the battle was worth it, not for your ego, but for your peace. Seneca once wrote, "A wise man is never overcome by insult, not because he doesn't feel it, but because he doesn't feed it." You felt it. You heard the remark. You saw the looks, and still, you refused to give them what they came for, your reaction. Because here's the truth. Nothing unnerves the manipulative, the arrogant, the insecure, like a man who is not emotionally available to be shaken, a man who absorbs tension without losing his ground, a man who can sit in fire and not flinch. That's who you were becoming. Your silence wasn't just a shield, it was a mirror. It reflected their intentions back at them. It made them sit with their own energy. And when people are forced to face themselves without distraction, they get uncomfortable. They squirm. They stutter. They over-explain. And you just stood there anchored. You began to speak less. But when you did speak, every word carried weight. Because it was no longer driven by emotion, it was driven by clarity. You weren't just reacting anymore. You were choosing. And that scared people more than rage ever could. Silence became your language. Your pause became your punctuation. And the stillness between your sentences, that was where your authority lived. They called you cold, detached, arrogant, even. But the truth was simple. They were used to controlling people through chaos, and you were no longer accessible. You'd trained your nervous system the same way you'd trained your muscles, to withstand pressure, to breathe under fire, to decide instead of react. You learned to let people talk, let them fill the air, let them try to provoke, poke, interpret, spin, and you sat still, not because you didn't care, but because you finally understood your energy is currency, and silence is how you save it. What used to pull you in now bounced off you. What used to ignite you now passed through like wind. Not because you were numb, but because you were rooted deep. This didn't make you soft. It made you unpredictable. And unpredictability is unsettling. It breaks patterns. It disrupts control. It forces people to see you as something they can't readapt, that, in a world obsessed with reaction, is terrifying. You didn't need revenge. You didn't need to explain your transformation. You didn't need to remind anyone of your worth. You just didn't flinch. And in a world that feeds on drama, that kind of self-command, it's not just respected, it's feared. You returned, but couldn't be read. When you came back, you didn't announce it. No big return. No dramatic statement. You just walked in same posture, same name. But everything else had shifted, and they felt it. Not immediately. At first, they thought you were the same face, same voice. But then they looked closer and couldn't find the man they remembered. You weren't smiling as much, not because you were bitter, but because you no longer needed to perform warmth to be accepted. You didn't talk to fill silence anymore. You didn't lean in to be liked. You didn't explain yourself when you were misunderstood. And that made people nervous. Because the version of you they were used to, he was easy to read. He'd overshare. He'd overreact. He'd try to make everyone comfortable even when it cost him his peace. But this new version, you were still watchful, selective, not distant but untouchable, like a mountain, like fire behind glass. They asked, "What happened to you?" You didn't answer, because it wasn't a question, it was a reaction to your presence, to your silence, to the discomfort they felt now that they could no longer predict you. You didn't owe them a story, not because you were trying to be mysterious, but because the truth wasn't for them. It was for you. You didn't need to explain what solitude had done to you, what the suffering had forged, what the silence had sharpened. They wouldn't get it, and you didn't need them to. You weren't rude. You were contained. Your boundaries weren't walls, they were gates, with locks. And not everyone had the key anymore. You were no longer afraid to let people misunderstand you. Because you understood something deeper. Mystery makes people uncomfortable, especially those who relied on your predictability. There's a certain kind of calm that can only come from a man who has already faced himself and survived. A man who's already been humiliated, broken, abandoned, and chose to rebuild anyway. Not for applause, not for revenge, but for clarity. Musonius Rufus once wrote, "The more a man is self-contained, the less he needs from others." And now, you needed very little. not out of arrogance, but because you'd cultivated what no one else could give you: inner command. That unnerved them. Your silence used to be seen as awkward. Now it felt dominant. The way you listened without rushing to respond, the way your eyes held theirs without flinching, the way you could sit in tension without needing to resolve it. People started adjusting their tone around you, watching their words, looking for cues, anything to interpret you. But there weren't many, because you weren't broadcasting anymore. You were rooted. And that groundedness, it was unsettling in all the ways. Power is unsettling when it's not loud, not explained, not asked for. Some started avoiding you, not because you'd done anything wrong, but because being around you exposed everything fake in them. And deep down, they knew it. You weren't trying to intimidate anyone. You were just walking in the truth you paid for. And the cost was high. You had bled for this composure, starved for this clarity, and now that you had it, you weren't giving it up for social ease or shallow approval. You didn't wear your strength like a costume. You carried it like a scar. And scars, real ones, don't need to be pointed at. They speak on their own. People looked at you and couldn't tell what you were thinking, couldn't predict how you'd respond, couldn't place you in their mental boxes anymore. And that's when you knew your mind was no longer just disciplined, it was unreadable. And that scared them more than anger ever could. They still talk, and you still win. No one tells you this, but when you truly grow, you become unrecognizable to the ones who once controlled you. And when they can't read you anymore, they talk. They still talk. They talk about the version of you they thought they knew, the one who was more predictable, more available, more convenient. They speculate. They wonder. They invent stories about where you went, about what you became, about what you're hiding. Let them, because their words no longer reach you, not because you're ignoring them, but because you've transcended the need to be understood by people who never truly saw you. You don't live there anymore. In that space where reputation was currency, where fitting in meant cutting pieces of yourself down to size. That man, they can keep talking about him. He's gone, buried under the weight of every decision you made in silence. And you're still here, still moving, still building. You don't correct their version of the story. You don't defend your silence, because what they don't know protects you, and what they don't understand defines them, not you. The world is loud, obsessed with performance, with exposure, with being seen. But the man you've become, he doesn't need spotlight. He doesn't need noise. He doesn't need his name in anyone's mouth to know who he is. You've already won, not by rising above them, but by returning to yourself, by taking everything they threw at you, every slight, every betrayal, every doubt, and converting it into fuel, into structure, into self-respect. And here's what they don't realize. While they talk, you live. While they guess, you act. While they compare, you grow. You didn't build this mind for them. You built it, so when the world gets loud again, when pressure returns, when betrayal knocks again, and it will, if you remain intact, grounded, unshaken. Epictetus said, if you seek truth, you must let go of reputation. That was the trade, and you made it. You gave up being understood in exchange for being free. So let them talk. Let them fill rooms with opinions. Let them analyze your distance, your quiet, your restraint. Let them confuse your peace for pride. Let them call your discipline obsession. Let them call your silence arrogance. It doesn't matter, because they talk, and you still win. You win every morning. You rise without needing a reason. You win every time you choose the difficult path without witness. You win when you feel pain and refuse to let it own you. You win when you walk away with your power intact and say nothing. You win because you know who you are, and you didn't learn it in comfort. You earned it in fire, and in a world addicted to reaction, to validation, to noise. That kind of calm, that kind of self-command, it isn't just respected, it's feared. If this spoke to you, you're not alone. There's a quiet brotherhood forming, men who've stopped explaining themselves, who've stepped away from noise and into self-command. Men who are tired of being ignored, tired of the friend zone, tired of pretending they're fine while silently collapsing inside. And if you're rebuilding, if you're sharpening your mind, your standards, your silence, you belong here. Subscribing to this channel isn't just about another video. It's a signal that you're choosing growth over distraction, discipline over drama, power over noise. By doing that, you're not only upgrading your own life, you're helping make this insight accessible to men who desperately need it. Men who've been dismissed, forgotten, underestimated, but who are quietly becoming something dangerous. This isn't a trend. It's a return to stillness, to strength, to you.